In the autumn of 1513, as Niccolò Machiavelli sat in exile penning his observations on power and human nature, he witnessed something that would fundamentally alter his understanding of control. A merchant named Lorenzo had arrived in the village, carrying with him nothing but a small leather pouch and an air of complete indifference to the local customs and hierarchies that governed the community. The townspeople, expecting him to pay the customary tributes and seek permission from various guilds and authorities, were astonished when Lorenzo simply began conducting his business as if these structures did not exist. What followed was remarkable. Rather than punish this apparent insubordination, the local authorities found themselves competing for Lorenzo's attention. The very act of not defending against their system of control had rendered him immune to it. He had nothing to lose because he had already accepted the loss of everything they thought they could take from him. This observation would later crystallize into one of Machiavelli's most profound but least understood insights. True power lies not in the desperate protection of what we have, but in the strategic abandonment of what we think we need to defend. The man who defends everything defends nothing effectively, while the man who defends nothing cannot be attacked at any meaningful point. Consider the nature of defense itself. When we take a defensive position, we immediately communicate several things to our opponents. We have something valuable to lose, we are afraid of losing it, and we believe they have the power to take it from us. Every fortress wall declares the wealth within, every guard announces the presence of treasure. Defense, by its very nature, is an admission of vulnerability disguised as strength. The merchant Lorenzo understood something that escaped even seasoned politicians and military commanders of his time. By refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the local power structures through defensive compliance, he had effectively removed himself from their sphere of influence. He could not be threatened with exile because he was already a stranger. He could not be threatened with financial ruin because he carried only what he needed. He could not be socially ostracized because he sought no social acceptance. This principle extends far beyond the realm of Renaissance Italian politics into the fundamental mechanics of human interaction and power dynamics. In our modern world, we see countless examples of individuals and organizations that have gained tremendous influence by refusing to play defense according to established rules. They do not argue against criticisms, they simply continue operating as if the criticisms were irrelevant. They do not defend their methods, they focus entirely on their results. They do not protect their reputation, they remain indifferent to reputation altogether. The technology industry provides numerous examples of this principle in action. Companies that have revolutionized entire sectors did not waste energy defending their approaches against traditional industry criticism. Instead, they operated with complete disregard for established norms and expectations. They were willing to be misunderstood, criticized, and even ridiculed because they understood that defense of their methods would only validate the authority of those seeking to control them. But the principle runs deeper than business strategy or political maneuvering. It touches on fundamental questions of identity and self-preservation. What makes us vulnerable to control by others is precisely our attachment to specific outcomes, possessions, or aspects of our identity that we feel compelled to defend. The moment we declare something as essential to our well-being or self-image, we have created a point of leverage that others can use against us. A man who declares he must have a particular job becomes controllable through threats to that employment. A woman who insists she must maintain a certain social standing becomes manipulable through threats to her reputation. An organization that positions certain assets as fundamental to its existence becomes vulnerable to anyone who can threaten those assets. The defense itself creates the vulnerability. This is not to advocate for nihilism or complete detachment from all goals and possessions. Rather, it is to recognize the strategic disadvantage of psychological and emotional dependence on things that exist within the sphere of other people's potential influence. The wise person maintains their attachments lightly, ready to release them when necessary, understanding that true security comes not from protecting what we have but from cultivating the ability to thrive regardless of what we lose. The historical record is filled with examples of leaders and nations that fell precisely because they could not abandon defensive positions that had become untenable. They poured resources into protecting territories, titles, or systems of control that their enemies had already identified as weak points. Meanwhile, their opponents often succeeded by being willing to sacrifice traditional markers of power in favor of more fundamental forms of influence. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow exemplifies this principle in reverse. The Russian strategy of refusing to defend fixed positions, of being willing to burn their own capital rather than allow it to become a source of leverage for their enemy, ultimately proved devastating to the French forces. The Russians understood that defending Moscow would mean playing by Napoleon's rules of engagement. By abandoning it, they forced him to fight on their terms, in conditions where his traditional advantages became liabilities. In personal relationships, the same dynamic often unfolds. The person who desperately defends every slight against their ego, who must win every argument, who cannot allow any criticism to go unanswered, becomes exhausting and, ultimately, loses influence. Meanwhile, the individual who remains unruffled by attacks on their character or methods, who does not feel compelled to justify their choices to others, often gains a mysterious authority that others find both compelling and unsettling. This authority derives from what others perceive as unshakable confidence, but what is actually strategic detachment. When you do not need others to validate your choices, you cannot be controlled through the withdrawal of validation. When you do not require external approval for your self-worth, you cannot be manipulated through criticism or praise. When you are genuinely indifferent to whether others understand your methods, you cannot be forced to explain yourself in terms that serve their agenda rather than yours. The merchant Lorenzo's approach worked because he had already internalized this principle. He was not indifferent because he was naturally callous or antisocial. He was indifferent because he understood that allowing others to determine the terms of his engagement would ultimately serve their interests rather than his own. By refusing to defend against their expectations, he maintained complete freedom of action. This freedom of action is perhaps the most practical benefit of the principle. When we are not bound by the need to justify our choices to others, we can make decisions based purely on their effectiveness rather than on their acceptability to various constituencies. When we are not constrained by the need to protect particular assets or positions, we can adapt quickly to changing circumstances. When we are not limited by the need to maintain certain appearances, we can focus entirely on achieving our actual objectives. The principle applies equally to collective entities. Organizations that spend enormous amounts of energy defending their practices, their reputation, or their market position often find themselves outmaneuvered by competitors who focus instead on simply doing better work. Nations that exhaust themselves protecting symbolic territories or diplomatic positions frequently lose ground to those willing to sacrifice prestige for practical advantage. Yet implementing this principle requires a fundamental shift in how we think about strength and security. We are conditioned from childhood to believe that strength means the ability to protect what we value, and security means ensuring that our important assets are safe from threat. The counterintuitive truth is that real strength lies in not needing to protect anything, and real security comes from being able to thrive even when we lose what we thought we needed. This shift in perspective requires what might be called the destruction of the weak self, the version of ourselves that exists only through external validation, that depends on particular circumstances for its sense of worth, that requires specific outcomes to feel successful. This weak self is not necessarily lacking in conventional strengths. It might be highly accomplished, widely respected, and materially successful. But it is weak because it exists only in relation to things that can be taken away. The destruction of this weak self is not a one-time event but an ongoing process of recognizing and releasing attachments that create points of vulnerability. It requires honest assessment of what we truly need versus what we merely want, of what serves our actual objectives versus what serves our ego, of what represents genuine strength versus what represents the appearance of strength. This process is particularly challenging in cultures that equate identity with achievement, worth with possessions, and strength with the ability to dominate others. The person who begins to detach from these conventional markers of success may initially appear to be failing or giving up. Only over time does it become apparent that they have gained something far more valuable, the freedom to act without the constant burden of defending their actions, the security that comes from not depending on external circumstances for their well-being, and the power that derives from genuine indifference to the opinions and threats of others. Part 2, The Architecture of Unassailable Strength. The spring of 1515 brought to Machiavelli's attention a most curious case study in the application of his emerging theories about defensive positioning and control. A young condottiere named Francesco had inherited a small but strategically positioned territory from his father, along with the traditional expectation that he would spend his resources fortifying its borders and maintaining the complex web of alliances that had supposedly kept his family safe for generations. Instead, Francesco did something that horrified his advisors and fascinated his enemies. He systematically dismantled every defensive structure his family had built over decades. He dissolved military alliances that required him to come to others' aid, abandoned fortified positions that demanded constant garrison, and even relinquished certain territorial claims that would have required ongoing defense. To observers, he appeared to be committing political suicide. What happened next would become legendary in the annals of Renaissance power politics. Rather than being overrun by enemies eager to exploit his apparent weakness, Francesco found himself in an unprecedented position of strength. His former allies, who had expected to call upon his resources for their own defensive needs, discovered they could no longer make demands of him. His enemies, who had prepared elaborate strategies to assault his fortifications, found they were attacking empty ground while Francesco had relocated his actual assets to positions they had not anticipated. Most remarkably, Francesco had transformed himself from a minor territorial lord, bound by dozens of mutual obligations and defensive commitments, into an independent power who could strike where and when he chose, unconstrained by the need to protect fixed positions or honor defensive pacts that primarily served others' interests. He had achieved through strategic abandonment what his father had never managed through decades of careful defensive positioning: true autonomy of action. This transformation illustrates the second crucial aspect of the principle that defending nothing enables control of everything. The architecture of unassailable strength is built not through accumulation but through elimination. Every defensive commitment we maintain represents not just a drain on resources but a limitation on our freedom of movement. Every position we feel compelled to hold represents not just a potential target for enemies but a constraint on our ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The conventional wisdom suggests that strength comes from building up defenses, accumulating resources, and establishing positions that can withstand attack. This approach creates what military strategists recognize as the fortress mentality: impressive-looking strongholds that become prisons for those within them. The fortress dweller must divide attention among all potential points of attack, must maintain constant vigilance against threats to fixed positions, and must ultimately always fight on ground chosen by besiegers rather than on terms of their own choosing. Francesco's approach embodied what we might call the nomad principle, maintaining only those commitments and positions that enhance rather than constrain freedom of action. Like the nomadic peoples who repeatedly outmaneuvered settled civilizations throughout history, he understood that mobility and adaptability often trumped static defensive strength. The nomad cannot be conquered because there is no fixed capital to capture, no permanent infrastructure to destroy, no predictable pattern of movement to exploit. In the realm of personal development and psychological strength, this principle manifests as the cultivation of what psychologists might term anti-fragility, the quality of becoming stronger through stress rather than merely resilient in the face of it. The person who has eliminated psychological dependencies on external validation, material possessions, or specific outcomes becomes functionally unattackable at the level where most interpersonal conflicts occur. Consider how most attempts at manipulation or control work: they rely on the target's attachment to something that can be threatened. Social pressure depends on the desire for acceptance. Economic coercion depends on the need for financial security. Emotional manipulation depends on the fear of losing relationships or status. Remove these dependencies, and the corresponding forms of control become ineffective. This does not mean becoming antisocial or indifferent to all outcomes. Rather, it means cultivating the psychological equivalent of Francesco's strategic flexibility, the ability to pursue goals and maintain relationships while remaining fundamentally independent of them for one's sense of security and self-worth. It means developing what might be called conditional attachment, engaging fully with people, projects, and possessions while maintaining the underlying understanding that none of these define or determine one's essential well-being. The man who destroys his weak self through this process does indeed become indestructible in the most practical sense. He cannot be destroyed because there is no fixed identity to attack, no essential dependency to threaten, no predictable pattern of attachment to exploit. Like water taking the shape of its container while remaining fundamentally unchanged by the process, he can adapt to any circumstance while maintaining his essential nature. This quality of psychological fluidity represents perhaps the highest form of strategic thinking. Sun Tzu wrote extensively about the advantages of formlessness in military engagement, the ability to appear weak when strong, strong when weak, to be where the enemy does not expect, to strike where they cannot defend. These tactical principles reflect a deeper strategic understanding. The side that maintains the greater freedom of movement and response ultimately controls the engagement, regardless of apparent resource disparities. In the modern context, we see this principle operating in numerous domains. Successful entrepreneurs often embody Francesco's approach by remaining detached from specific business models, products, or markets, ready to pivot completely when circumstances change. They build companies around principles and capabilities rather than around fixed offerings, allowing them to adapt rapidly to new opportunities without the burden of defending obsolete positions. Similarly, individuals who achieve lasting success in creative fields typically develop the ability to remain unattached to specific projects, styles, or even identities. They understand that defending yesterday's artistic choices or creative reputation can prevent them from exploring new possibilities. The writer who must defend every previous work becomes unable to grow. The artist who cannot abandon familiar techniques remains trapped within self-imposed limitations. The principle extends into leadership and organizational dynamics. The most effective leaders often display what appears to be indifference to traditional markers of authority, impressive offices, formal titles, elaborate protocols. This apparent indifference actually represents strategic detachment. They understand that real authority comes from the ability to influence outcomes, not from the symbols that others associate with power. By not defending the trappings of leadership, they maintain focus on the substance of leadership. Organizations that embody this principle typically outperform those that spend significant energy protecting their reputation, defending their market position, or maintaining elaborate corporate structures. Companies like Amazon succeeded partly by demonstrating willingness to cannibalize their own products and services rather than defend them against superior alternatives. They understood that the energy spent defending existing revenue streams could be better invested in developing new capabilities. This organizational application reveals another crucial aspect of the principle: the destruction of the weak self, whether individual or collective, requires ongoing commitment rather than a single decision. The temptation to return to defensive positioning emerges whenever we achieve something we begin to consider worth protecting. Success itself can become a weakness if it creates new attachments and defensive obligations. Francesco's story did not end with his initial strategic abandonment. Throughout his career, he repeatedly faced the choice between consolidating gains through defensive positioning or maintaining his strategic flexibility through continued detachment. Each time he chose consolidation, he found himself gradually returning to the constraints and vulnerabilities he had originally escaped. Each time he chose continued flexibility, he discovered new opportunities that would have been impossible to pursue from a defensive posture. This pattern suggests that the principle of defending nothing to control everything is not a technique to be applied occasionally but a fundamental orientation toward power and security. It requires cultivating comfort with uncertainty, developing confidence that derives from internal resources rather than external circumstances, and maintaining the discipline to choose effectiveness over ego satisfaction. The psychological challenges of this approach cannot be underestimated. Human beings appear to be naturally inclined toward territorial behavior, toward identifying with their possessions and achievements, toward seeking security through accumulation and defense. Overcoming these inclinations requires not just intellectual understanding but emotional and physical practice in releasing attachment when it becomes constraining. Yet the rewards of this practice extend far beyond strategic advantage. The person who has learned to hold achievements lightly experiences greater satisfaction from the process of achievement itself. The individual who does not depend on external validation for self-worth discovers more authentic sources of confidence and motivation. The leader who remains unattached to the symbols of power finds greater effectiveness in the exercise of actual influence. Perhaps most significantly, this approach offers a resolution to one of the fundamental paradoxes of human ambition: the tendency for success to create new forms of limitation and vulnerability. The conventional path of accumulating power through defensive positioning ultimately creates a prison of obligations, threats, and constraints. The unconventional path of maintaining power through strategic detachment offers the possibility of genuine freedom even within the pursuit of ambitious goals. Francesco's legacy was not the territory he controlled or the wealth he accumulated, both of which proved temporary. His lasting contribution was the demonstration that strength could be built through subtraction rather than addition, that security could be achieved through flexibility rather than fortification, and that true power lay not in the ability to defend what one had but in the freedom to become what circumstances demanded. Part 3, The Invincible Man and the Paradox of Ultimate Control. By the winter of 1517, Machiavelli had observed enough examples of his principle in action to understand its most profound and disturbing implications. The cases of Lorenzo the merchant and Francesco the condottiere had demonstrated tactical applications of strategic detachment, but they were merely glimpses of a more comprehensive possibility, the emergence of what he privately termed the invincible man, an individual so thoroughly detached from conventional sources of vulnerability that he became functionally uncontrollable by any external force. The first time Machiavelli encountered such a person, he nearly missed the significance of the meeting entirely. Cardinal Alessandro della Rovere had requested an audience, ostensibly to discuss certain political writings that had been circulating in manuscript form. Machiavelli expected the typical exchange, a powerful man seeking to co-opt, threaten, or bargain with a potential rival or ally. Instead, he found himself face to face with someone who seemed to exist entirely outside the normal calculations of power and influence. The cardinal listened to Machiavelli's carefully prepared arguments about political theory with apparent interest but without any of the reactions that such arguments typically provoked. He did not seem impressed by references to classical authorities, threatened by implications about the fragility of established power, or excited by the possibility of gaining new strategic advantages. Most unsettling of all, he appeared genuinely indifferent to whether Machiavelli approved of him, agreed with him, or considered him worth further attention. This encounter would haunt Machiavelli for years, not because the cardinal had been hostile or manipulative, but because he had been utterly unreachable. Every rhetorical strategy that Machiavelli employed, flattery, intellectual challenge, veiled threat, passionate argument, simply passed through the man like light through clear water. It was as if the cardinal existed in a realm where the normal tools of human influence simply did not apply. Only later did Machiavelli realize what he had witnessed, a human being who had so completely destroyed his weak self that he had achieved a form of practical invincibility. The cardinal could not be threatened because he genuinely did not fear loss of position, wealth, or even life. He could not be flattered because he derived no satisfaction from others' opinions. He could not be bargained with because he wanted nothing that others could provide or withhold. He had become, in the most literal sense, unconquerable. This realization forced Machiavelli to confront the ultimate implications of his own insights about defensive positioning and control. If defending nothing truly enabled control of everything, then the logical endpoint of this principle was the emergence of individuals who existed beyond the reach of conventional power structures entirely. Such people would not simply be difficult to control, they would represent a fundamental challenge to the very concept of control as it applied to human relationships and social organization. The cardinal exemplified what happens when the process of destroying the weak self reaches its completion. He had eliminated not just strategic vulnerabilities but all psychological dependencies that could create leverage points for others to exploit. He maintained his ecclesiastical position and performed its duties competently, but he was not psychologically invested in preserving that position or advancing within the church hierarchy. He engaged with political and theological questions thoughtfully, but he did not need to win arguments or convince others of his viewpoints. He treated all worldly concerns, including his own welfare, with what appeared to be genuine equanimity. This state of being presents a paradox that goes to the heart of human nature and social existence. On one hand, the cardinal had achieved the ultimate form of personal freedom and security. No external force could compel him to act against his judgment, no threat could make him compromise his principles, no inducement could make him betray his authentic nature. He had solved, once and for all, the problem of being controlled by others. On the other hand, this same invincibility created a form of isolation that most people would find unbearable. The cardinal existed in a realm of complete autonomy, but this autonomy meant that he could not be reached by normal human emotions, desires, or connections. His invincibility came at the cost of what others might consider the most meaningful aspects of human experience: the vulnerability that makes love possible, the attachment that gives achievement significance, the dependency that creates genuine community. This paradox illuminates a crucial aspect of the principle that defending nothing enables control of everything. The ultimate expression of this principle, complete invincibility through total detachment, may be logically perfect but humanly questionable. It represents a form of strength that transcends normal limitations while potentially sacrificing normal satisfactions. Yet Machiavelli observed that the cardinal did not appear to suffer from this state of detachment. If anything, he seemed more capable of genuine enjoyment, authentic relationship, and meaningful action than most people. His detachment from outcomes did not make him indifferent to processes. His freedom from external control did not make him insensitive to others' welfare. His invincibility to conventional threats did not make him callous toward human suffering. This observation led to perhaps Machiavelli's most significant insight about the nature of ultimate control. The person who has truly mastered the principle of defending nothing actually gains the freedom to engage more fully and authentically with life, not less. Because they do not need specific outcomes for their psychological well-being, they can pursue goals with complete commitment while maintaining perfect equanimity about results. Because they do not depend on others' approval for their self-worth, they can relate to others more honestly and generously. Because they are not driven by ego needs or survival fears, they can make decisions based purely on wisdom and compassion. The cardinal demonstrated this paradox in practice. During their conversation, he displayed more genuine interest in Machiavelli's ideas than most people who desperately wanted to impress or influence the former secretary. He asked more penetrating questions than those who needed to demonstrate their own intelligence. He offered more useful insights than those who sought to establish their authority. His very indifference to the normal goals of conversation made him a more engaging and valuable conversational partner. This pattern extends beyond individual psychology into broader questions about power, leadership, and social organization. The leader who has destroyed his weak self, who does not need to maintain authority for ego satisfaction, who does not fear losing position, who does not require others' validation of his decisions, often proves more effective at actually leading than those who are driven by these conventional motivations. Because he is not defending his leadership position, he can focus entirely on leading well. Similarly, the organization or nation that has internalized this principle, that does not need to defend its reputation, maintain its traditional role, or preserve its established advantages, often proves more adaptable and, ultimately, more successful than those consumed with defensive positioning. Because it is not wasting energy on protection of obsolete assets, it can invest all its resources in developing new capabilities and exploring new possibilities. The technology sector provides numerous examples of this principle operating at organizational scale. Companies that achieve lasting dominance typically do so not by defending their initial advantages but by repeatedly cannibalizing their own products and services in favor of better alternatives. They understand that the willingness to destroy their current weak selves, their dependence on existing revenue streams, their attachment to familiar technologies, their investment in established market positions, enables them to control the trajectory of entire industries. Amazon's evolution from bookstore to comprehensive commerce platform to cloud computing provider illustrates this principle in action. At each stage of development, the company demonstrated willingness to risk its existing business model in pursuit of superior opportunities. This willingness to abandon defensive positions around current success created the freedom to explore possibilities that more defensive competitors could not pursue without threatening their core operations. The personal application of this principle requires understanding that the destruction of the weak self is not a negative process but a creative one. It involves not the elimination of goals, relationships, or achievements but the transformation of one's relationship to these things. Instead of needing specific outcomes for psychological well-being, one learns to find satisfaction in the quality of effort applied toward worthy goals. Instead of depending on others' approval for self-worth, one develops internal standards based on character and competence. Instead of requiring external validation of one's value, one cultivates confidence rooted in actual capabilities and authentic self-knowledge. This transformation process typically involves a series of voluntary losses, deliberately releasing attachments that have become constraining, abandoning positions that require defensive energy, walking away from relationships or opportunities that demand compromise of essential principles. Each voluntary loss strengthens the capacity for future detachment while revealing new possibilities that were previously invisible due to defensive obligations. The man who has completed this process becomes, in Machiavelli's terms, truly indestructible because there is no longer a weak self that can be destroyed. What remains is something more essential and, therefore more durable, a core identity that exists independently of circumstances, relationships, or achievements. This core cannot be threatened because it does not depend on anything external for its existence or value. Yet this invincibility, paradoxically, often makes such individuals more rather than less engaged with the world around them. Because they do not need to succeed for ego satisfaction, they can take greater risks in pursuit of worthwhile goals. Because they do not fear failure, they can attempt more ambitious projects. Because they are not driven by personal insecurity, they can focus entirely on contributing value to others. The cardinal exemplified this engagement without attachment. He remained deeply involved in church affairs, political developments, and intellectual debates, but his involvement was characterized by what might be called passionate detachment, complete commitment to excellence combined with complete acceptance of whatever results emerged from that commitment. He cared deeply about outcomes while being psychologically independent of them. This state represents the resolution of another fundamental human paradox, the apparent conflict between caring and freedom. Most people assume that caring deeply about something necessarily creates vulnerability to suffering if that something is lost or threatened. The invincible man discovers that the opposite is true, that genuine caring actually requires freedom from attachment to specific outcomes, because such attachment distorts judgment and constrains action. When we need a particular result for our psychological well-being, we cannot evaluate situations clearly or respond appropriately to changing circumstances. Our need creates bias in our perception and limitation in our responses. Only when we are free from such needs can we see clearly enough to be genuinely helpful and act wisely enough to be genuinely effective. The ultimate paradox of control, then, is that the person who seeks to control others or circumstances for their own psychological needs inevitably becomes controlled by those needs. The person who eliminates such needs gains the freedom to influence others and circumstances far more effectively, not through manipulation or force but through the natural authority that comes from operating without hidden agenda or personal desperation. This authority is immediately recognizable to others, even when they cannot articulate what makes it different from conventional forms of power. People sense that they are dealing with someone who cannot be bought, threatened, or manipulated, and this recognition often generates a form of respect and trust that more conventional power cannot command. The invincible man's very invincibility becomes a source of influence that extends far beyond what he could achieve through defensive positioning or aggressive pursuit of control. In the end, Machiavelli concluded, the man who defends nothing controls everything not through domination but through demonstration. By embodying the possibility of genuine freedom from external control, he reveals to others the limitations of their own defensive strategies and the possibilities inherent in strategic detachment. His example becomes more persuasive than any argument, his presence more influential than any position, his character more compelling than any achievement. The cardinal lived and died without ever seeking to rule others, yet his influence on those who knew him proved more lasting and transformative than that of many who wielded conventional power over thousands. He had achieved the ultimate form of control, the kind that operates through inspiration rather than coercion, through demonstration rather than domination, through being rather than doing. He had proved that when you defend nothing, you indeed control everything, including the most important thing of all, yourself.